Today is Saturday, September 3rd, and today we're doing our best to cut out any sensationalism or politics about the sometimes very controversial topics of gun violence and gun laws, and even how or if mental illness plays a role. Instead, we're focusing on what the data shows about all of it, like who is really most at risk of getting hurt and the actions that may actually keep people safer. And because we know mass shootings and the news in general can often cause anxiety and fear, we'll also chat with a therapist about how best to manage those feelings if they come up for you when sending kids off to school or going to a crowded place. But first up, I'm speaking with researcher and practicing emergency physician, Dr. Megan Ranny. She's the academic dean for the School of Public Health at Brown University and co-founder of a nonprofit bringing together medical and public health experts focused on responsible gun stewardship and reducing the rate of firearm injuries and deaths. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Dr. Megan Ranny, thank you for coming on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me on today.
So let's first talk about some of the data when it comes to gun violence and gun deaths. After the Uvalde school shooting specifically, a lot of people were talking about how firearms are the leading cause of death for children, more than car accidents and all of that. Is that true? And what do you think people should know about that statistic?
So sadly, that is a true statistic here in the United States. But it's important for us to understand that that doesn't mean that those mass shootings are the leading cause of death. Instead, most of those deaths are actually a combination of everyday homicides and, sadly, firearm suicides, as well as some unintentional or accidental deaths.
Can you give us an idea, maybe both for children and all Americans, including adults, what the share of each of those categories is?
So for all Americans of all age groups, on an average year, somewhere around 60 to 70% of gun deaths in the United States are gun suicides. Around a third of deaths across all age groups are gun homicides, which includes law enforcement-involved shootings. And only about 1% are those public mass shootings. Only about 1% are those accidental or unintentional injuries. Among kids, those proportions are a little different. Most deaths in kids are homicides. It's kind of reversed. It's about 2/3 homicides, around 1/3 suicide, and the other third is kind of split between suicide and unintentional deaths.
And the CDC says a record number of people died in gun-related deaths in the U.S. in 2020. Does that mean that it's becoming more common, or is it the population just bigger? What does that tell us?
What that tells me is two things. First, it's that there are more firearms out there in private hands than ever before. We saw a lot of people buy guns for the first time during COVID out of a sense of fear, a desire for personal protection. Those are often not stored safely. They're often folks that bought them during COVID don't know how to use them properly, and they've been used, unfortunately, to hurt each other. I think it also reflects a lot of the societal dysfunction that we've experienced over the last 2 years.
Have mass shootings become more common in recent years?
They have become more common in recent years, but we see blips up and down. We actually saw a decrease in the number of those public mass shootings, particularly school shootings, in 2020 and 2021, because so many schools across the United States were closed. This past year, we've had some very public tragedies, and we'll see what the rest of the year brings. Most mass shootings, according to the Secret Service or FBI definition, are actually domestic. A family member shooting themselves, shooting a partner, and then shooting other family members.
And what is that definition? 4 or more people dying?
That's correct.
And for parents who may feel scared to send their kids off to school, what are the chances of there being a shooting at your child's school? What do you want to tell parents about that?
The risk of there being a shooting at any elementary, middle, or high school across the United States is, of course, higher than it is in other countries, but it's still quite low. Although children across the U.S. are at higher risk of dying of a firearm than anything else, that mostly doesn't happen in school. It happens on streets or at home.
What should parents and just Americans in general be doing right now, regardless of the response to mass shootings, that could help this problem?
So the first thing is, around 40% of households across the United States have a firearm. If you are one of those households, Make sure that your firearm is stored as safely as possible, ideally locked up and unloaded. And even if you think your kid doesn't know where it is, I'll bet you they do. They know where you hide the birthday presents. They know where the gun is stored. The second thing is to know what the warning signs are for your kid or someone else being at risk of hurting themselves or being hurt by a firearm. Those are things, of course, like depression, but also substance use, domestic violence. The third thing is to know what to do if you or your kid notices those risk factors in someone that's close to you. As a parent of a middle schooler who's now using social media, we've had discussions about what to do when she sees kids threatening each other online or bullying each other, how to safely respond to that herself and who to let know in her school or to let me know, to let kind of the larger community know. The last thing is to not hesitate to be involved in your school committee, in your community, in politics and advocacy to help keep our kids safer.
And as we're thinking about solutions, especially ones that get discussed post the latest mass shooting and tragedy, there's always debate about stricter gun laws, and then there's also talk about mental health. So let's start with the mental health issue. Is there research looking into the role of mental illness and how it does play a role in gun violence and specifically mass shootings?
There is, and that research is honestly inconclusive. So there are a bunch of studies that suggest that mental illness is not a risk factor for committing a mass shooting. There are other studies that suggest that folks who are having suicidal thoughts are slightly more likely to commit a mass shooting compared to others. At the end of the day, the biggest risk factor actually for one of being the perpetrator of one of those horrific events is a prior history of violence, particularly domestic violence.
What about gun laws? Can they work? And if so, is there any information about what types of laws might work best?
Policies that make a difference include things like universal background checks, making sure that people with a history of domestic violence can't have access to a firearm, and includes things like red flag laws. Those are policies that allow temporary removal of firearms from the home of someone who's showing themselves to be high risk of hurting themselves or others. There are also safe storage laws mandating that folks with kids in the home keep their firearm stored safely. But with any of these types of laws, the law alone is not what makes the difference. It's the community norms and the enforcement of those policies and laws that actually changes the patterns of firearm injury.
What about banning assault weapons? That's just the last kind of law that I want to touch on because it is always discussed.
The vast majority of firearm deaths in this country are with handguns. And most of the firearms that are sold in the United States are semi-automatic, whether they are handguns or semi-automatic long guns like assault weapons. What many of us in the policy world think is actually the most important thing is the size of the magazine or the number of bullets that you can shoot quickly without reloading. That's what makes those mass shootings so deadly. But to me, really, the goal here is separating folks who have intent to harm from something that can cause harm.
Anything else you want to add, or just a final takeaway for people listening and who care about this issue one way or the other?
The final thing to add is that this issue is something that concerns every one of us across the United States. And when we actually do surveys of Americans, regardless of your politics, regardless of whether you're a firearm owner or not, every one of us wants to see the number of gun deaths decrease. Every one of us wants our kids and our family members to be safe, which highlights that at its base, this is a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue, not a mental health issue. It's about us treating this the same way that we've treated every other kind of injury or illness across history. And if you take nothing else away from this podcast, it is knowing that there is data around who's most likely to get hurt. And there are also really good ways for us to decrease the number of injuries and deaths in this country that are within our reach, both through legislation, but also through non-legislative actions. And so I'd encourage folks to spend some time learning about some of those changes and how they can help put them in place in their own community.
Still ahead, it's normal to feel afraid when you hear about violence, even if it's happening far away from you. Next up, we're joined by a licensed family therapist, Emma McAdam, who you may know from her popular YouTube channel, Therapy in a Nutshell. She explains why we get worked up about things that, based on the data, are not likely to happen, and how to calm those emotions so we can still live the life we want. But first, a quick break to thank our sponsors. The Newsworthy is brought to you by ZocDoc. If you're like my family, you like to pore over lists of reviews before deciding on where to book a reservation for brunch or dinner. So why not do the same when you're booking a doctor's appointment? With ZocDoc, you can see real, verified patient reviews to help find the right doctor in your network and in your neighborhood. ZocDoc is a free app that shows you doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, and are available when you need them. Yep, that's the other key here. You filter your search to only show doctors that take your insurance, which is such a time saver. And on ZocDoc, you can find every specialist under the sun. Whether you're trying to straighten those teeth, fix an achy back, get a mole checked out, or anything else, ZocDoc has you covered. Plus, ZocDoc's mobile app is as easy as reserving that brunch spot online or getting delivery to your house. Search, find, and book doctors with a few taps. Go to ZocDoc.com/newsworthy and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then start your search for a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/newsworthy, ZocDoc.com/newsworthy. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Indeed. Business success stories often start with someone who had a great idea and then found great people to help them. If you're hoping to make headlines, you need to build a great team. You need Indeed. Well, Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's a powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. I appreciate that there are tools and a proven system right there at your fingertips. For example, Indeed assessments can give you a window into how candidates will be on the job. U.S. Indeed data found that on average, applicants who scored highly proficient or higher on the reliability assessment were nearly 8 times more likely to consistently attend work. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/newsworthy. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/newsworthy. Indeed.com/newsworthy. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Okay, here's my conversation with therapist Emma McAdam. Emma McAdam, thank you so much for coming on the Newsworthy.
Oh, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I want to reference a survey from the American Psychological Association first that found nearly 80% of U.S. adults say they feel stress over the possibility of a mass shooting, and 1/3 say this fear stops them from going to certain events or places. Even when the likelihood of a mass shooting is actually very small. So first, why do we feel fear and anxiety over something that statistically probably won't happen?
Our brain's number one job is to keep us alive. It's not to keep us happy. And we are primarily emotional beings, not rational beings. So when we hear something like a mass shooting on the news, our brain is going to trigger that fight, flight, freeze response because any perception of danger is something that our brain is going to really highlight, make really important. And that's really what emotions do. They accentuate the information we're receiving and try to motivate us to take action like you described to avoid certain situations that we perceive as dangerous.
When we actually are safe, let's say we're walking into a movie theater, but because of one mass shooting that has happened in a theater, we get nervous every time. But we don't want to stop being able to go to the movies. So what's your recommendation? What do we do about it?
So the first thing we need to do is ask, am I actually in danger right now? Is something dangerous happening in this present moment? If the answer is no, then the response should be, let's learn to calm our bodies down. And we can communicate with our nervous system through our body using these body-based skills like, most people have heard of deep breathing. So taking slow, deep breaths. Progressive muscle relaxation is where you kind of systematically go through your body. You tense and relax. When we relax our muscles, it sends a message to our brain that we're safe, and it starts this feedback loop saying that we're safe. And there's a lot of other skills you can use to regulate your nervous system. One of my favorites is to yawn. So if you try to yawn right now, you take a big yawn, you lift up the top of your mouth, your soft palate. That triggers your nervous system to calm down. And I would guess that some viewers hearing us yawn are going to start yawning because that's triggering their nervous system to relax. So that's one option when you start to feel scared or anxious, to practice calming your body.
Does that happen naturally sometimes? Because I used to yawn every time before I would go on live TV.
Absolutely. It is a natural response. And you'll see it with dogs sometimes. Like I had this dog who loved car rides. She'd get in the car and she'd start doing these big yawns. And that is one of the ways that these pack animals, which we're inherently social creatures, would communicate to each other. Hey, don't freak out. Don't get into a frenzy. Calm yourselves down. And it is a natural response. And that's also why it's contagious. Our nervous systems actually communicate with each other on a very subconscious level.
Are the recommendations the same when we're afraid for someone else's safety? Say we're a parent feeling anxious about sending our child off to school. What would you say to a patient about that kind of fear for someone else?
As a parent myself, this is really normal. That's the first thing I would say. It's normal to feel concerned for your child's safety. So there's a couple approaches, right? So I mentioned if we are actually safe right now, we do practice calming our body. But the next question we ask is there something I can do about this right now? Is there an action I can take or should take? You know, with the Uvalde shootings, I was upset about it. And I asked myself this question. And the most practical answer, the most helpful answer was not don't send your kids. It wasn't do more trainings on how to avoid getting shot. The answer was, for me personally, to send an email to my congressperson. We have to ask ourselves what action is reasonable and helpful in these situations.
And kind of separating ourselves from the emotion of it, like consciously trying to say, here's what I'm feeling and here's what I'm going to do about it.
You'll see this conversation happening a lot with people who do outdoors sports. They acknowledge that there's risk, and they're actually very intentional about the risks they're going to choose to live the life that they want to live. If we let the emotions run our show, then it might look like, oh, never going anywhere, never sending our kids anywhere, being worried all the time. And if we choose our values, we say, okay, I want to live this life. I acknowledge that sending my child to school includes a very, 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 very minuscule risk. And the alternative is not sending my child to school, which has a very high risk of impacting them socially or academically. And so I'm going to choose the values that are most helpful for me here. This is the best thing I can do about this situation. And I'm going to accept and make space for and soothe the emotions that come with the value-based lifestyle that I want to live.
How do we support other people who may be feeling, whether it's this kind of anxiety from the news or something more traumatic? Maybe they did survive a mass shooting or war or something like that. For one or both of those scenarios, how do we best support our loved ones?
It's usually not helpful to tell someone like, hey, you need to just get over this. You shouldn't be worried, whether people have or haven't experienced trauma. For people who are really scared, ask them good questions. Like, how are you feeling about this? Tell me about your processes in making your decisions. Explain to me. Help me understand why you don't want to go to X location. And what's that like for you? I think people in general want to be asked these questions when they know that someone's also going to listen in a safe way. So empathic listening is where you're not trying to give advice. You're not trying to agree or disagree or judge or not judge or any of that. You're just like, let me try to understand what you're saying. And you can ask some clarifying questions.
Final thought on this topic.
I think when you learn how your brain works and how your brain is wired to create an emotional response, then you can learn to manage that and then also to look for the good, because the world is actually safer than it's ever been.
Well, thank you so much to both of our guests for sharing their expertise. Be sure to follow both Dr. Megan Ranny and therapist Emma McAdam on social media. We have links in our episode notes so you can find them. The Newsworthy will be off on Monday for the Labor Day holiday, but we'll be back in your podcast feed on Tuesday with your next 10-minute news roundup. Our regular weekday episodes give you all the news of the day starting at 4 a.m. So we'll chat again on Tuesday. Until then, have a great holiday weekend.